In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a sacred Sunday service turns deadly when Reverend Hargreaves sips poisoned communion wine. Cyanide claims his life, and suspicion falls on those closest to him: his secretive wife, Clara, the loyal sexton, Blackwood, the ambitious deacon, Pike, and the fearful ward, Eliza. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the tangled web of greed, betrayal, and hidden truths. A stolen fortune, a forged ledger, and a vial of poison lead to a shocking revelation, but will the killer strike again before the truth is uncovered? Chapter 1. The Sunday Service. The morning sun filtered through the ancient yews of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled shadows on the cobbled path to St. Bartholomew's Church. The air held the crisp bite of early autumn, and the village, nestled in its quiet corner of England, stirred with the gentle rhythm of Sunday. The church bells rung with the steady hand of Timothy Blackwood. The sexton pealed across the meadows, summoning the faithful to morning service. Inside, the stone walls of the church, worn smooth by centuries of devotion, glowed faintly in the light of stained glass saints. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace mittens folded neatly in her lap, occupied her customary pew near the back, where she could observe without being observed. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, took in the familiar scene: the polished oak pews, the faint scent of beeswax, and the soft rustle of hymnals as the congregation settled. Reverend Clement Hargreaves stood at the altar, his white surplice pristine, his voice steady as he intoned the opening prayer. He was a man of middle age, with a kind face and a scholar's stoop, beloved for his quiet wisdom and tireless service to the parish. The communion table was set with care, the silver chalice gleaming beside a bottle of sacramental wine, its dark glass catching the light. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to those nearest the Reverend. In the front pew sat Clara Hargreaves, his wife, her youthful beauty softened by a somber black dress. Her hands, clasped tightly, betrayed a certain restlessness, though her expression remained composed. Beside her was Eliza Gray, the Reverend's ward, a slight girl of 18, with pale cheeks and downcast eyes, her plain bonnet framing a face that seemed to carry an unspoken burden. To the side, in the choir stalls, Lawrence Pike, the deacon, adjusted his hymn book with a practiced smile. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, a touch too fine for a village deacon, Miss Marple noted. His movements were deliberate, as if aware of eyes upon him. Behind the scenes, she knew, Timothy Blackwood would be tending to his duties, polishing brass, arranging vestments, his gruff demeanor hiding a fierce loyalty to the church and its rector. The service proceeded with its familiar cadence: hymns, sung with varying degrees of enthusiasm, a sermon on charity that held the congregation's attention, and finally, the communion. The villagers filed to the altar, kneeling to receive the bread and wine. Miss Marple, as always, watched closely. Clara sipped the wine with a delicate grimace, as if its tastes displeased her. Eliza hesitated before drinking, her fingers trembling on the chalice. Mr. Pike took his portion with a nod to the Reverend, his smile unwavering. The sexton, absent from the communion line, was likely in the vestry, preparing for the service's close, as the final blessing was given. Miss Marple felt a faint unease, a whisper of instinct honed by years of quiet observation. Something in the church felt amiss, though she could not yet name it. The congregation dispersed, exchanging pleasantries under the yew trees. But by evening, the village was alight with whispers. Reverend Hargreaves had collapsed in the vicarage, his breath ragged, his face ashen. Dr. Haydock, summoned in haste, pronounced him dead within the hour. The cause, he confided to the constable, was poisoned cyanide, traced to the communion wine. Miss Marple, sitting by her lace-curtained window, her knitting needles paused, considered the morning's events. The wine, kept in the vestry, was accessible only to a few. The Reverend's death was no accident, and the circle of suspicion was small but tangled. Clara, Elisa, Pike, Blackwood each had been near the altar. Each had a life interwoven with the Reverend's. As the village mourned, Miss Marple's mind began to sift through the details, her gentle smile belying the sharpness of her thoughts. A puzzle had been set before her, and she would unravel it, thread by thread. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Suspicion. The vicarage parlor, with its faded chintz, curtains, and worn mahogany furniture, seemed to shrink under the weight of the tragedy that had befallen St. Mary Mead. The afternoon sun slanted through the mullioned windows, casting long shadows across the room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The air was thick with the scent of lavender polish and the faint, lingering bitterness of grief. Constable Reed, a young man with an earnest face and a tendency to fidget, stood by the fireplace, his notebook open but his pencil idle. He had come to the vicarage, seeking guidance, for the death of Reverend Clement Hargreaves was no ordinary matter, and the village was already buzzing with conjecture. Miss Marple, her white hair neatly tucked beneath a lace cap, appeared the picture of serene domesticity, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She had known the Reverend for years, a man of quiet conviction, whose sermons, though not fiery, carried the gentle authority of true faith. His death, so sudden and sinister, had shaken the village to its core. The constable, out of his depth in matters of poison and motive, had sought her out, knowing her reputation for unraveling the tangles of human nature. "It's a bad business, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "Dr. Haydock says it's cyanide, no mistake, in the communion wine, of all things. Whoever did this knew the Reverend would drink first." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild concern, though her mind was already turning over the morning's events like a jeweler examining a flawed gem. "Cyanide is a cruel choice," she murmured, quick but deliberate. "And the wine in the vestry, was it not?" "Yes, ma'am," Reed replied, flipping through his notes. "Locked in a cupboard, but the key hangs on a hook by the door. Not much security if you ask me. The Reverend, the sexton, the deacon, and maybe Mrs. Hargreaves, they'd all have known where to find it. And Miss Gray?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively casual. "The ward? Well, she lives here, so I suppose she might have known too." Reed scratched his head. But a slip of a girl like that, hard to imagine her mixed up in something so wicked. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "People are often more than they seem, Constable. Now, tell me, who was in the church before the service?" Red recounted the morning. Timothy Blackwood, the sexton, had been there early, setting out hymnals and filling the chalice with wine from the bottle. Lawrence Pike, the deacon, had been in and out of the vestry, ostensibly organizing the choirs. Music. Mrs. Clara Hargreaves had arrived just before the service, helping her husband with his vestments. Eliza Gray, the Reverend's ward, had been seen in the churchyard, though no one could confirm her exact movements. The Reverend himself had been in the vestry until the service began. "That's the lot, far as we know," Reed concluded. "But anyone could have slipped in, I suppose." "The church doors never locked." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A village church is a trusting place," she said softly. "But trust can be a dangerous thing. I should like to speak with them, if I may." Discreetly, of course. Reed, relieved to have her assistance, agreed at once. The vicarage parlor became their makeshift headquarters, and one by one the suspects were summoned. Miss Marple arranged herself in a high-backed chair, her knitting a shield of harmlessness, while Reed stood by, trying to look authoritative. The first to enter was Clara Hargreaves, her face pale beneath a widow's veil, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. She was a woman in her early 30s, with delicate features and auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper. Her grief seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers. the way her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting interruption. "I can't believe he's gone," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Clement was everything to me. He was so good, so kind. Who could do such a thing?" She dabbed at her eyes, but the tears, Miss Marple observed, were slow to come. "Indeed, it is a terrible loss," Miss Marple said gently. "You were in the church this morning, Mrs. Hargreaves. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone near the vestry, perhaps?" Clara shook her head. "I was helping Clement with his surplice. He was particular about it. You know, always wanted it just so. I didn't go near the wine. I wouldn't even know where it was kept." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the handkerchief, noting its fine embroidery, a luxury for a vicar's wife. "And your husband," she continued, "was he troubled lately? Any worries about the parish, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "He was tired," she said at last. "The parish is small, but the work never ends. He mentioned the accounts once or twice, but I didn't pay much mind. I'm no good with numbers." She offered a weak smile, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her mind filing away the hesitation for later consideration. Next came Timothy Blackwood, the sexton, a wiry man in his 50s, with weathered hands and a face lined by years of outdoor labor. His gray hair was close cropped, and his eyes, a pale blue, held a guarded intensity. He stood stiffly, cap in hand, as if unused to being indoors. "I've worked for the Reverend these 20 years, he said gruffly. Never a cross word. Between us, I'd no cause to harm him. "You prepared the vestry this morning, Mr. Blackwood?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "Aye, same as always. Filled the chalice, set out the bread. The wine bottle was in the cupboard, like usual. I locked it after, and the key was on its hook." His voice was steady, but his hands twisted the cap, betraying a flicker of unease. "Did you see anyone else in the vestry?" Miss Marple pressed, her needles clicking rhythmically. Blackwood frowned. "Mr. Pike was there, poking about the hymnals. Said he was checking the choir's music, but he lingered longer than needed. Didn't think much of it at the time." He shrugged, but Miss Marple noted the edge in his voice, a hint of distrust toward the deacon. Lawrence Pike entered next, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to Blackwood's rough simplicity. He was a man in his late 30s, with dark hair swept back and a smile that seemed to invite confidence. His suit, Miss Marple observed, was of a quality rarely seen in St. Mary Mead, its cut suggesting London tailors rather than the local draper. He sat with an easy grace, crossing one leg over the other, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "A dreadful business," Pike said, his voice smooth. "The Reverend was a fine man, though perhaps a touch old-fashioned. I can't imagine who'd want him dead." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw in them a flicker of calculation, quickly masked. "You were in the vestry this morning, Mr. Pike?" she asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "Briefly," he replied. "I was sorting the choir's hymnals. Some of the boys are careless, you know. I didn't touch the wine. My duties are more administrative." He smiled again, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous tick that belied his calm. "And where were you during the service?" she inquired. "In the choir loft, with the singers. I help keep them in tune, so to speak." He chuckled, but the sound fell flat in the quiet room. Miss Marple's needles paused, "And you saw nothing unusual? No one near the vestry door, perhaps?" Pike's smile tightened. "Not a soul. The church was quiet until the service began." He leaned forward slightly, as if to emphasize his sincerity. But Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her mind noting the polished ease of his answers. Eliza Gray was the last to enter, her slight figure almost lost in the heavy folds of her morning dress. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of grief and fear. She sat on the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if bracing herself for a storm. Miss Marple, with her knack for putting the young at ease, offered a gentle smile. "My dear, this must be very hard for you. The Reverend was like a father. I understand." Eliza nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He took me in when I had no one. I can't believe he's gone." Her eyes filled with tears, and this time, Miss Marple noted, they were genuine. Spilling over without artifice. "Where were you this morning, before the service?" Miss Marple asked, her tones soft but probing. "In the garden," Eliza said quickly. "I was picking flowers for the altar. I do it every Sunday." Her voice trembled, and she looked down, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. "And you saw no one near the vestry?" Miss Marple pressed, her eyes kind but unyielding. Eliza shook her head, but the movement was too quick, too emphatic. "No one," she whispered, but her eyes darted to the side, as if afraid of being caught in a lie. As the interviews concluded, Constable Reed looked to Miss Marple, his expression one of bewildered frustration. "They all seem so ordinary," he said. "But one of 'em's lying, aren't they?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Oh, my dear Constable, people are rarely as ordinary as they seem. There is a pattern here, but it is not yet clear. The wine, the vestry, the Keithies are the threads we must follow, and we must look closely at those closest to the Reverend, for poison is a personal thing, requiring both opportunity and motive." She rose, folding her knitting into her bag. "I should like to see the vestry, if I may, and perhaps the church accounts. The Reverend was a careful man, was he not? He may have left us a clue." Reed nodded, grateful for her clarity. As they stepped out into the fading light, Miss Marple's mind was already at work. Sifting through the morning's details, Clara's nervous hands, Blackwood's guarded loyalty, Pike's polished charm, Eliza's fearful silence. Each had a role in the Reverend's life, and one, she was certain, had ended it. The shadow of suspicion hung over them all, but Miss Marple knew that shadows, when examined closely, often revealed the truth. Chapter 3. The Vicarage. Household. The Vicarage. A modest Georgian house with ivy clinging to its weathered bricks stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, its windows glowing softly in the late afternoon light. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked the short path from the church, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was still reeling from Reverend Hargreaves' death, and whispers of poison had begun to weave through the tea rooms and cottages. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by gossip. She preferred the quiet clarity of observation, and the vicarage, she knew, held secrets in its everyday corners. Inside, the house was a study in genteel frugality. The hall, with its faded runner and polished umbrella stand, spoke of careful maintenance rather than wealth. Miss Marple was ushered into the drawing-room by a nervous maid, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested she had been weeping for her late master. The room was comfortable but worn, a sagging sofa, a chipped tea table, and a fireplace where a small fire crackled against the autumn chill. On the mantel stood a photograph of the Reverend and Clara on their wedding day, her smile radiant, his expression one of quiet pride. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the frame, noting the faint dust around its edges, as if it had not been touched in some time. Clara Hargreaves entered, her auburn hair pinned loosely, her morning dress accentuating her pallor. She offered Miss Marple tea, her movements graceful but strained, as if each gesture required effort. "I hope you'll forgive the state of things," she said, her voice soft. "It's been difficult." She poured from a chipped teapot, her hands steady but her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "There is nothing to forgive, my dear," Miss Marple replied, accepting a cup. "A house in mourning is never quite itself. You've lived here long." 3 years, Clara said, settling into a chair. Since Clement took the living, it's a quiet life, but he loved it. Her voice caught, and she looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her saucer. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting its faint bitterness, perhaps a reflection of the household's mood. And Miss Gray, she joined you later, I understand. Clara nodded. Eliza came to us 2 years ago, after her parents died. Clement felt it his duty to take her in. She's a good girl, but shy, keeps to herself. There was a pause, and Clara's eyes flicked to a closed door leading to the study. Miss Marple followed her gaze, her mind registering the gesture. The door opened, and Eliza Gray appeared, her small frame almost swallowed by a heavy shawl. Her dark eyes, large and wary, met Miss Marple's with a flicker of apprehension. "You wished to see me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Only to talk, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "A tragedy like this touches everyone, and I thought you might have noticed something, living here as you do." Eliza sat, perching on the edge of a chair like a bird ready to take flight. "I don't know anything," she said quickly. "I was in my room most of yesterday, reading. I only came down for the service." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "You must have been very fond of the Reverend. He was good to you, I hear." "He was," Eliza whispered, her hands twisting the shawl. "He was kind, like a father. I can't believe someone would hurt him." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her cheeks flushing. Before Miss Marple could press further, the maid announced Timothy Blackwood. The sexton entered, his boots scrupulously clean, but his expression dour. He nodded to Clara, who excused herself, murmuring something about checking on dinner. Eliza hesitated, then followed, leaving Miss Marple alone with Blackwood. He stood awkwardly, his cap clutched in his hands, his weathered face set in lines of stubborn loyalty. "You've served the church a long time, Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple began, her tone conversational. "You must know its rhythms better than anyone." 20 years, he said gruffly. "The Reverend was a good man, kept the place running proper, never complained about the work, not like some." Eyes flicked toward the door, and Miss Marple caught the hint of disapproval. "You mean Mr. Pike?" she prompted, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. Blackwood's jaw tightened. "He's new, ain't he? Always talking about changes, new hymnals, new services." "The Reverend didn't hold with it. Said the old ways were best." He paused, then added, "Saw him in the vestry more than once, fussing about. Never trusted him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "And you, Mr. Blackwood? You were in the vestry yesterday morning, preparing the communion." "As always," he said. "Filled the chalice, checked the bread. Everything was as it should be. I locked the cupboard after, and the key was where it belongs." His tone was defiant, but his eyes held a flicker of unease, as if he feared his routine might betray him. Miss Marple thanked him, and he left, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. Alone, she rose and wandered the room, her eyes taking in the small details, a stack of hymnals on a side table, a vase of wilting roses, a letter half hidden beneath a cushion. She lifted it gently, noting the London postmark and Clara's name. In a masculine hand, tucking it back, she made a mental note to inquire further. The door opened again, and Lawrence Pike entered unannounced, his smile as polished as his cufflinks. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly. "I heard you were here and thought I might save you the trouble of summoning me." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but her eyes assessing. "I was just admiring the vicarage. It's a charming house, though it must feel empty now." Pike nodded, settling into a chair without invitation. "A great loss to us all. The Reverend was traditional, but respected. I hope to carry on his work, perhaps with a few modern touches." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on his knee, a sign of restlessness. "You've taken on a good deal of responsibility as deacon," she said. "The choir, the account's quite a burden for one man." Pike's smile didn't waver. "I manage. The Reverend trusted me with the books, and I like to think I've brought some order to them." He was a scholar, not a financier. He laughed lightly, but Miss Marple's mind snagged on the word financier, an odd choice for a village deacon. "And you were in the church yesterday, before the service?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a vicar's sermon. "Briefly," Pike replied. "I was checking the choir's music. The boys can be careless, and I like things done properly." He leaned back, his posture relaxed, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw. As Pike spoke, Clara returned, her face composed, but her eyes red. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "Eliza's not well. I've sent her to lie down." Her gaze flickered to Pike, and Miss Marple caught a moment of unspoken tension between them. "No trouble at all," Miss Marple said, rising. "I've taken enough of your time. Thank you, Mr. Pike, Mrs. Hargreaves." She smiled, but her mind was already sorting through the morning's impressions. Clara's guarded glances, Eliza's nervous withdrawal, Blackwood's distrust, Pike's calculated charm. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the Reverend's life. And one, she was certain, led to his death. As she stepped into the garden, the air cooled against her cheeks. Miss Marple paused by a rosebush, its petals bruised by an early frost. The vicarage household was a fragile thing, she thought, bound by duty and secrets. Somewhere within its walls lay the truth about the poisoned wine, and she would find it as surely as she found the dropped stitches in her knitting. Chapter 4. The vestry's secrets. The church of St. Bartholomew stood silent under a sky bruised with gathering clouds, its ancient stones exuding a quiet solemnity that seemed to rebuke the village's growing unease. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella tucked under one arm, made her way through the lich-gate, her steps soft on the mossy path. The air carried the damp promise of rain, and the churchyard, with its leaning headstones, felt like a place where secrets might linger. She had persuaded Constable Reed to grant her access to the vestry, for it was there, she was certain, that the key to Reverend Hargreaves' murder lay hidden. The vestry door, heavy oak with an iron latch, creaked as she entered, revealing a small room that smelled of old paper and candle wax. The space was cramped, its walls lined with shelves of hymnals and vestments. A narrow window admitting a sliver of gray light. A wooden cupboard stood in one corner, its lock gleaming dully, and a small table held a clutter of candlesticks and a worn prayer book. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, took in every detail: the scuffed floorboards, the faint dust on the shelves, the key hanging on a hook by the door, just as Blackwood had described. She began her examination with the cupboard, where the communion wine was kept. The lock was simple, easily opened with the key, and inside she found a single bottle, half empty, its label smudged but intact. This was not the poisoned bottle that had been taken by the police, but its presence suggested routine. A bottle like this would be noticed if tampered with, she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of the shelf. Yet the poison was added with no one the wiser. Her attention shifted to the table, where a few papers lay scattered: a roster of choir boys, a list of upcoming services, a note about roof repairs. Nothing seemed amiss, but Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her to look beyond the obvious. She moved to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of the hymnals, their leather bindings cracked with age. Behind one row, almost hidden by a stack of prayer books, she found a slim ledger, its cover faded green, its pages slightly warped, as if it had been tucked away in haste. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the neat columns of figures. It was a record of church donations, each entry marked with dates and amounts, written in the Reverend's precise hand. The sums were modest tuppence from Mrs. Price, a shilling from the baker's widow, but a few entries stood out. Large donations, listed as anonymous, appeared irregularly, followed by withdrawals of similar amounts, marked only as parish expenses. The handwriting for these entries was subtly different, the ink a shade darker, the strokes more deliberate. "Curious," Miss Marple said softly, her needles pausing in her bag. "A careful man like the Reverend would not be so vague." She tucked the ledger under her arm, intending to show it to Constable Reed, and continued her search. The vestry held little else of note: a box of candles, a spare surplice, a chipped saucer used for ash. But as she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something under the tableau, a small glass vial, no larger than a thimble, its stopper missing. She bent to retrieve it, holding it to the light. It was empty, but a faint chemical scent clung to it, sharp and acrid. "Not communion wine," she murmured, wrapping it in her handkerchief. Cyanide, she knew, could be stored in such a vial, though proving it would require Dr. Haydock's expertise. Miss Marple stepped outside, the first drops of rain pattering on her umbrella. The churchyard was empty, save for a blackbird darting among the yews. She stood for a moment, her mind sifting through the morning's discoveries. The ledger suggested financial irregularities, but by whom? Blackwood, with his access to the vestry, could have tampered with the wine, though his loyalty seemed unshakable. Pike, with his frequent visits, had opportunity, and those anonymous donations raised questions about his modest deacon's role. Clara, as the vicar's wife, might know more about the accounts than she admitted, and Eliza, always hovering on the edges, could have slipped into the vestry unnoticed. As she walked back to the vicarage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vial. It was a deliberate clue, left behind by carelessness or design. Someone was in a hurry, she said to herself, or wanted it found. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming on her umbrella, but her mind was clear. The vestry was a place of routine, yet it had been violated, its sanctity turned to poison. She would need to speak to each suspect again, to watch their eyes and hands. For the truth, she knew, often lay in the smallest gestures. Back at the vicarage, she found Constable Reed waiting, his face anxious. "Anything, Miss Marple?" he asked, eyeing the ledger and the handkerchief-wrapped vial. "Perhaps," she said, her tone mild. "This ledger is most interesting, and this vial. Well, Dr. Haydock will tell us more. But we must be patient, Constable. The truth is like a garden, it requires tending before it blooms." Reed nodded, though his expression suggested he preferred a quicker harvest. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. The vestry had given up its secrets, but they were only the beginning. The threads of motive and opportunity were weaving together, and she would follow them, stitch by careful stitch, until the pattern was complete. Chapter 5. The wife's burden. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a soft gray veil, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the vicarage once more. Her black umbrella bobbed above her slight figure, and her sensible shoes avoided the puddles with practiced ease. The village, subdued by the Reverend's death, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next revelation. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles in her bag, was determined to find it. Clara Hargreaves, the Reverend's widow, had lingered in her thoughts since their last meeting, the nervous hands, the fleeting glances toward the study door. There was a story there, and Miss Marple intended to hear it. The vicarage door was opened by the same tearful maid who ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room. Clara was already there, standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the rain-streaked glass. She turned, her auburn hair catching the dim light, and offered a fragile smile. "Miss Marple, you're kind to come again," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I'm afraid I'm not much company today." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with her knitting. "In times of grief, a little conversation can be a comfort. Shall we have some tea?" Clara nodded, ringing for the maid. As they waited, Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, noting the same worn furnishings, the photograph on the mantel, and a small writing desk in the corner, its drawer slightly ajar. The ledger from the vestry was still in her possession, safely tucked away, but she had not mentioned it to Clara yet. Timing, she knew, was everything. The tea arrived, and Clara poured with care, though her hands trembled slightly, betraying her composure. Miss Marple accepted a cup, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "You must find the vicarage very quiet now," she said. "It's a large house for two, and with Eliza so retiring." Clara's lips tightened. "It is quiet," she admitted. "Clement was always busy as sermons, visits, the accounts. I tried to help, but he preferred to manage things himself." She paused, her fingers brushing a faint stain on her sleeve. Miss Marple noted, as she had before. "The accounts," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "He was particular about them, I suppose. A man of his character would be." Clara nodded, her eyes flickering to the desk. "Very particular. He said the church's money was a sacred trust. I didn't always understand his methods, but he was meticulous." Her voice wavered, and she took a sip of tea, as if to steady herself. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And yet, mistakes can happen, even with the most careful men. Did he ever mention discrepancies? Anything that troubled him?" Clara's cup rattled against its saucer. "Discrepancies? No, not really. He was tired lately, as I told you. The parish work was heavy, and he worried about the roof fund. But nothing like that." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up her neck. The room was silent save for the patter of rain and the faint crackle of the fire. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "My dear, you mustn't feel you need to protect anyone. The truth has a way of coming out, and it's better it does so gently, don't you think?" Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking. But she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "There's nothing to protect," she said. "I loved Clement. I would never have hurt him." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But a wife knows her husband's burdens, even those he doesn't share. That desk, for instance, did he keep his papers there? Sermons, perhaps, or letters?" Clara's gaze darted to the desk again, and Miss Marple saw her fingers tighten on the teacup. "Just sermons," she said, "and some old letters. Nothing important. I haven't touched it since." Her voice broke, and she set the cup down, her hands trembling. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Grief makes everything harder," she said. "But you'll let me know if you remember anything, won't you? Even the smallest detail can matter." Clara murmured agreement, but her eyes were distant, and Miss Marple knew she would get no more today. As she rose to leave, she paused by the desk, her fingers brushing the drawer. "Locked, I suppose?" she asked lightly. "Yes," Clara said, too quickly. "Clement kept the key. I don't know where it is now." Miss Marple smiled, her mind cataloging the lie. The drawer was ajar, and a key was not needed to see that. She thanked Clara and stepped into the hall, where the maid was polishing a brass candlestick with unnecessary vigor. "Is Miss Gray about?" Miss Marple asked. "She's resting, ma'am," the maid replied. "Not been herself since the Reverend passed." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the girl's fearful eyes. As she left the vicarage, the rain had eased, leaving the air fresh and heavy with the scent of wet earth. The ink stain on Clara's sleeve, the locked desk, the guarded answers, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was beginning to see their shape. Clara was hiding something, not necessarily murder, but a secret that weighed on her. The ledger, with its mysterious entries, suggested money as a motive, and Clara, as the Reverend's wife, would have known his habits, perhaps even his suspicions. As she walked toward her cottage, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Blackwood's loyalty was fierce, but even the loyal could act out of desperation. Pike's polish hid ambition, and his access to the vestry made him dangerous. Eliza's fear suggested knowledge, perhaps of something she dared not speak, and the vial from the vestry, now with Dr. Haydock, might confirm the poison's source. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in time with her thoughts. The wife's burden was real, but whether it was grief, guilt, or something else, only time and careful observation would tell. Chapter 6. The sexton's silence. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its mourning like a heavy cloak, the usual chatter of its lanes muted by the shadow of Reverend Hargreaves' death. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the persistent drizzle, made her way toward the sexton's cottage, a squat stone building tucked behind the churchyard. The path wound through ancient yews, their branches drooping under the weight of rain, and the air carried the earthy scent of damp moss. Her black umbrella shielded her from the wet, but her mind was far from the weather, focused instead on Timothy Blackwood, the sexton whose gruff demeanor and steadfast loyalty had piqued her. Curiosity. The cottage was as unassuming as its occupant, its windows small and curtained, its garden a practical patch of herbs and vegetables rather than flowers. Miss Marple knocked, her gloved hand firm on the weathered door. After a moment, Blackwood appeared, his gray hair damped from some outdoor task, his workman's hands smudged with polish. He blinked at her, surprise flickering across his lined face. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Didn't expect you here." "I hope I'm not intruding," she replied, her tone as warm as a fireside chat. "I was passing, and thought we might talk about the Reverend. You knew him so well, after all." Blackwood hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing her into a sparse parlor. The room was tidy but stark, a single chair by a scrubbed table, a shelf with a few books, a fire burning low in the grate. No photographs, no ornaments, nothing to suggest a life beyond duty. He offered her a seat, remaining standing himself, as if uneasy in his own home. "Not much for tea and such," he said gruffly, "but I can fetch some if you like." "No need," Miss Marple said, settling her knitting in her lap. "I shan't keep you long. It's only that you've served St. Bartholomew's for so many years, Mr. Blackwood. You must have seen things others miss." He shrugged, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do my work. Keep the church clean, the bells rung, the graves tidy. The Reverend trusted me to see two things proper, and so you did," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "You prepared the vestry for the service, as always. Did you notice anything out of place that morning? A bottle moved, perhaps, or a stranger about?" Blackwood's jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the stone floor. "Everything was as it should be," he said. "Wine in the cupboard, chalice on the table, key on the hook. I don't fuss with what ain't my business." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle interest. "Of course, but you mentioned Mr. Pike being in the vestry more than usual. Did that strike you as odd?" Blackwood's eyes darkened, a flicker of disdain crossing his face. "He's always poking about, that one. Says it's for the choir or some such. But he's got no call to be in there half the time. The Reverend didn't like it neither. Told him once to stick to his duties." He paused, then added, "Saw him there Saturday evening, late. Looked startled when I came in." "Saturday evening," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft, but her mind sharp. "And what were you doing there so late, Mr. Blackwood?" He flushed, his hands clenching his cap. "Checking the roof slates. Been leaking, and the Reverend wanted it fixed before winter. I wasn't spying, if that's what you're thinking." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You're a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. Did the Reverend seem troubled when you spoke with him? About the roof, or perhaps something else?" Blackwood hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He was tired," he said at last. Said the parish was weighing on him. Mentioned the accounts once, how they didn't always add up. But he didn't say more, and I didn't ask. Wasn't my place. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes studying the sexton's weathered face. His loyalty to the Reverend was palpable, but there was a rigidity to his manner, a silence that felt like more than reticence. "You've given me much to think about," she said, rising. "One last thing, did you ever see Miss Gray or Mrs. Hargreaves near the vestry that morning?" Blackwood shook his head. Mrs. Hargreaves was with the Reverend, fussing over his surplus Miss Gray. "I saw her in the churchyard, picking flowers, like she does. Didn't see her inside." His tone was flat, but Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on inside, as if he were guarding his words. She thanked him and stepped back into the rain, her umbrella snapping open with a practiced flick. The cottage door closed behind her, and she stood for a moment, the drizzle pattering softly. Blackwood's devotion was genuine, she thought, but devotion could blind as well as bind. His mention of Pike's late visit to the vestry was a new thread, one that tangled with the ledger's irregularities and the vial's sharp scent, and his silence about the accounts. Had he truly not asked, or was he protecting the Reverend's memory? As she walked toward the village, Miss Marple's mind turned over the sexton's words. His life was one of routine, yet routine could conceal as much as it revealed. She recalled a gardener in her youth, a man of similar stoicism, who had hidden a theft behind his dutiful facade. Blackwood's cottage, so bare of personal touches, suggested a man with little to hide or, perhaps much to conceal. The rain fell harder, but Miss Marple's thoughts were clear, each detail a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. Chapter 7. The Deacon's Ambition. The sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a tentative light on the village's slate roofs and cobbled lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl neatly pinned, walked with a purposeful step toward the church hall, a low stone building adjacent to St. Bartholomew's. The hall, used for parish meetings and choir rehearsals, was where Lawrence Pike, the deacon, had agreed to meet her. His polished manner and frequent presence in the vestry had lingered in her thoughts, and the ledger's irregularities pointed to a man whose ambitions might stretch beyond his modest role. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung lightly at her side, its contents a quiet reminder of her unassuming guise. The hall smelled of polished wood and faintly of lavender, a remnant of the Women's Guild's recent meeting. Pike was already there, standing by a table strewn with hymn sheets, his dark suit as immaculate as ever. He turned at her approach, his smile broad but calculated, like a shopkeeper greeting a discerning customer. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak, "a pleasure to see you. I hope I can be of some help in this dreadful business." "You're very kind to spare the time, Mr. Pike," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with her knitting. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their gentle facade, noted the gleam of his cufflinks, the monogrammed handkerchief tucked in his pocket. "A deacon's duties must keep you busy, especially now." Pike nodded, taking a seat opposite her, his posture relaxed but alert. "They do, indeed. The Reverend relied on me for the choir, the accounts, and sundry tasks. He was a scholar, not a man for details." He chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, marking the rhythm of her thoughts. "The accounts," she said, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "You mentioned helping with them. I suppose you found everything in order?" Pike's smile tightened, just a fraction, as much as could be expected. "The parish is small, the donations modest. There's always a bit of juggling, roof repairs, charity funds, the like, but I kept things tidy." He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his fingers adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize. She nodded, her expression one of mild curiosity. "It's admirable, keeping such careful records. I found a ledger in the vestry, you know, a record of donations. Some entries were unusual, large sums, anonymous, and then withdrawn. Did you ever notice anything of the sort? Pike's eyes flickered, though his smile held. Anonymous donations. Not uncommon in a parish like this. People give what they can, sometimes without wanting praise. As for withdrawals, the Reverend handled those. I only recorded what he told me. His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight pause before recorded, as if he were choosing his words with care. You must have worked closely with him, she said, her needles pausing. Did he ever seem troubled? About the accounts, perhaps, or other matters? Pike shrugged, his hands spreading in a gesture of openness. He was tired, as I told you. The parish work was endless sermons, visits, repairs. He mentioned the accounts once or twice, said they were a burden, but he never confided anything specific. I assumed it was the usual strain. He met her gaze, his eyes steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers lingered on his handkerchief, as if seeking reassurance. She shifted tack, her tone as gentle as ever. You were in the vestry often, I hear. Saturday evening, for instance, and again before the service. You must have a keen eye for the church's needs. Pike's smile faltered, then recovered. Saturday. Oh yes, I was checking the hymnals. The choir boys are careless, and I like to ensure everything's in place. As for Sunday, I was there briefly, setting out music. Routine, really. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. I had no reason to touch the wine, Miss Marple. My duties don't extend to the communion. Of course, she said, her smile disarming. But a man like you, so capable, must have plans for the parish. The Reverend, I understand, was fond of tradition. Did you ever find that limiting? Pike's eyes narrowed, just for a moment. He was a good man, but yes, set in his ways. One suggested a few changes, new hymns, a modernized service, but he preferred the old paths. Still, we got on well enough. He laughed, a touch too brightly. I'm not one to push where I'm not wanted. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. A wise approach. Ambition can be a fine thing, but it wants patience. She rose, folding her knitting into her bag. You've been most helpful, Mr. Pike. I shan't keep you from your duties. He stood, bowing slightly. Always a pleasure, Miss Marple. If there's anything more I can do, you've only to ask. His smile was impeccable, but as he turned away, Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his posture, a stiffness that belied his charm as she stepped into the village lane. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky with streaks of gold. Pike's ambition was clear, she thought, but ambition could curdle into something darker when thwarted. The ledger's entries, his frequent vestry visits, his polished exterior all pointed to a man who wanted more than a deacon's role could offer, and that handkerchief monogrammed and costly suggested means beyond his station. Had he helped himself to the church's funds, only to find the Reverend's scrutiny too close? The vial in the vestry, the poison in the wine Pike had the opportunity, but motive required. Proof. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the others. Clara's guarded manner, Eliza's fear, Blackwood's silence, each held a piece of the puzzle. But Pike's ambition, like a bright thread in a dull weave, stood out. She would need to watch him closely. 4 men like him, she knew, were never quite as careless as they seemed. Chapter 8. The wards fear the late afternoon light filtered through the vicarage garden, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn where Miss Jane Marple stood, her black shawl draped over her shoulders. The rain had ceased, leaving the air fresh and heavy with the scent of wet roses. She had come to speak with Eliza Gray, the Reverend's ward, whose nervous silences and fleeting glances had lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. The girl's fear, so palpable during their brief encounters, suggested a knowledge she dared not share, and Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, was determined to coax it out. The garden was quiet, save for the distant chirp of a thrush and the soft rustle of leaves. Eliza was there, as Miss Marple had hoped, kneeling by a flower bed, her hands busy with a trowel. Her plain dress was smudged with earth, and her dark hair, escaping its bonnet, framed a face pale with strain. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes wide and startled, like a deer caught in a lantern's glow. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "What a lovely garden. I see you've a gift for it." Eliza's hands stilled, the trowel trembling slightly. It's nothing special," she murmured, brushing dirt from her fingers. "The Reverend liked the roses. I tried to keep them nice for him." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her shoulders hunching as if to ward off a blow. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, her knitting bag at her side. "It's a kind thing you do, keeping his memory alive. She said he was very fond of you, wasn't he? Taking you in as he did." Eliza nodded, her eyes fixed on the flower bed. "He was good to me. After my parents died, I had no one. He gave me a home, taught me to read his books, to love the church." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a quick, almost angry gesture. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a comforting rhythm in the stillness. "It must be hard, losing him so suddenly, and in such a way. You were in the garden that morning, I believe, before the service." Fingers tightened on the trowel. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was picking flowers for the altar. I always do, for Sunday." She glanced up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment before darting away. "And you saw nothing unusual?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "No one near the vestry, perhaps, or anything out of place?" Eliza shook her head too quickly. "No one. I was just here." Her voice trembled, and she stabbed the trowel into the earth, as if to anchor herself. Miss Marple watched, noting the girl's hunched posture, the way her hands shook despite her efforts to steady them. "My dear," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly, "you mustn't be afraid to speak. The Reverend would want the truth to come out, don't you think? Even if it's painful." Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know anything," she said, her voice rising. "I was in the garden, that's all. I didn't see anyone. I didn't do anything." She dropped the trowel, her hands covering her face, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt. There, Miss Marple said, her voice as calm as a summer afternoon. "No one's accusing you, child. But sometimes we see things we don't realize matter. A word, a glance, small things can mean so much." She paused, her eyes kind but unyielding. "Did you hear anything, perhaps? Voices in the church, or an argument?" Eliza's hands lowered, revealing a face streaked with tears. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Finally, she whispered, "I heard voices. A few weeks ago, not the morning of the service. The Reverend and Mr. Pike, in his study. They were arguing about money, I think. I didn't mean to listen, but the door was open, and I was passing by." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. "Money," she repeated softly. "Did you catch what they said?" Eliza shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Not much. The Reverend said something about trust, and Mr. Pike sounded angry, said it was a mistake. I didn't stay, I didn't want them to know I'd heard." She looked down, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. "I shouldn't have said anything. It's probably nothing." "It's never nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring. "You've done right to tell me. And that morning, in the garden, did you see Mr. Pike, or anyone else, near the church?" Eliza's eyes flickered with fear, and she hesitated, her breath catching. I saw someone, near the vestry window. Just a shadow moving quick. I thought it was Mr. Blackwood, maybe, checking the slates. I didn't look long, I was afraid." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "You've been very brave, Eliza. You mustn't worry. The truth has a way of protecting those who help it along." She rose, her knitting tucked into her bag. "You'll let me know if you remember anything else, won't you?" Eliza nodded, her eyes still wide, and Miss Marple left her to the roses, the girl's fear lingering like a chill in the air. As she walked back through the garden, the setting sun cast long shadows, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the new pieces of the puzzle. Eliza's account of the argument between Pike and the Reverend confirmed her suspicions about the ledger's irregularities. The shadow by the vestry window was less clear. Blackwood, Pike, or someone else entirely, the girl's fear suggested. She knew more than she had said, perhaps out of loyalty or terror. Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, her eyes scanning the church's silhouette against the fading light. Eliza's youth and vulnerability reminded her of a niece, long ago, who had kept silent out of fear until gently coaxed. The ward's secret, whatever it was a thread in the tapestry, and Miss Marple would pull it carefully, lest it unravel too quickly. For now, Pike's argument and the shadow by the vestry pointed to a motive rooted in money, and she would need to tread softly to uncover the rest. Chapter 9. The Ledger's Truth. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, the last vestiges of autumn sunlight fading into a twilight that seemed to mirror the village's somber mood. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlor, a modest room warmed by a small fire and the soft glow of a single lamp. Her knitting lay untouched on the table, for her mind was occupied with the ledger from the vestry, now spread open before her. Its pages, filled with the Reverend's precise script, and those curious, darker entries, held the promise of answers if only she could decipher their meaning. The vial from the vestry, now with Dr. Haydock for analysis, was another piece of the puzzle. But it was the ledger that drew her focus tonight. Constable Reed had granted her permission to examine the vicarage study, and she had arranged to visit that evening, hoping to find the key to the locked desk Clara had so pointedly avoided. As she donned her shawl and hat, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the threads she had gathered: Clara's nervous glances, Blackwood's guarded loyalty, Pike's polished ambition, and Eliza's fearful silence. Each was a stitch in the pattern, but the ledger, with its anonymous donations and vague withdrawals, suggested a motive rooted in greed. She tucked the ledger under her arm and stepped into the cool night, her umbrella a precaution against the ever-present threat of rain. The vicarage was quiet when she arrived, the maid admitting her with a weary nod. Clara was absent, attending a neighbor's condolence visit, and Eliza was upstairs, leaving the house eerily still. Constable Reed met her in the hall, his young face etched with the strain of a case that felt beyond his grasp. "I found the key, Miss Marple," he said, holding up a small brass object. "It was in the Reverend's desk, tucked in a book. Mrs. Hargreaves didn't mention it, but I thought you'd want to see inside." "Well done, Constable," Miss Marple said, her tone warm, but her eyes sharp. "Let us see what secrets the Reverend kept." The study was a small, book-lined room, its air heavy with the scent of old leather and ink. The desk, a sturdy oak piece, stood against a window overlooking the garden, its surface cluttered with papers, a Bible, and a half-burned candle. Reed unlocked the drawer, revealing a neat stack of letters, a few receipts, and a second ledger, its cover identical to the one from the vestry. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "2 ledgers," she murmured. "How very interesting." She opened the new ledger, her fingers careful, as if handling a fragile relic. The entries mirrored those in the vestry ledger, but with a difference: the anonymous donations were absent, and the withdrawals were meticulously detailed charity funds, roof repairs, a stipend for the choir. The handwriting was the Reverend's, unmistakable in its careful loops, and the ink matched throughout. "This is his true record," Miss Marple said softly. "The other, in the vestry, has been altered." Reed frowned, peering over her shoulder. Altered. You mean someone's been tampering with the books? Indeed, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking faintly as she set the ledger down. The vestry ledger shows large sums coming in and out, marked as anonymous or vague expenses. This one shows no such transactions. Someone has been adding entries to conceal their actions, and I suspect those actions involve theft. Reed's eyes widened. Theft? From the church? But who'd dare? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the letters in the drawer, tied with a faded ribbon. She lifted them gently, noting the same London postmark she had seen on the letter in the drawing room. Someone with access to the vestry and knowledge of the accounts, she said. Someone who could write in a hand close enough to the Reverend's to pass muster. She opened one letter, scanning its contents. A polite note from a London solicitor, addressing Clara about a small inheritance. Nothing incriminating, but the connection to London intrigued her. Could it be Mrs. Hargreaves? Reed asked. His voice hushed. She'd know his writing, and she's been jumpy about that desk. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone cautious. But we mustn't leap to conclusions. The ink on her sleeve suggests she's been writing, but not necessarily forging. And Mr. Pike, as deacon, handled the accounts. His hand is precise, and he has the means to procure things like cyanide, perhaps from London contacts. Reed nodded, though his expression was one of growing confusion. And Blackwood. He's in the vestry all the time. True, Miss Marple said, closing the drawer. But his life is simple, his means modest. The ledger's forgeries require a certain sophistication, and Eliza, poor child, knows more than she says, but I doubt she has the skill for this. She paused, her eyes narrowing. The vial, Constable has Dr. Haydock reported back. Not yet, Reed said. He's testing it, but he says it's likely cyanide, small enough to hide, easy to use. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A calculated choice. Whoever used it knew the Reverend's habits knew. He would drink first, during communion. She glanced at the ledger again, her mind weaving the threads together. The thief needed to silence him, perhaps because he was growing suspicious. These ledgers are the key, but we need more to tie them to the poison. As they left the study, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Pike's frequent London trips, mentioned in passing by the village postmistress. A man of his ambition, with his costly accessories, might see the church's funds as a means to an end. But Clara's ink-stained sleeve and Eliza's overheard argument could not be dismissed. And Blackwood, with his quiet devotion, might know more than he let on. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was close, hidden in the interplay of these lives, waiting for her to unravel it with the patience of a knitter untangling a knot. Chapter 10. The Village Gossip. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the mist that clung to the village like a soft veil. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl neatly pinned, made her way to the village shop, a hub of local chatter, where the pulse of St. Mary Mead could be felt most keenly. The shop, run by the sharp-eyed Mrs. Bantry, was a modest affair with shelves of tinned goods and a counter cluttered with jars of sweets. Its true currency, however, was gossip, and Miss Marple knew that the villagers' whispers, when sifted carefully, often held grains of truth. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Bantry looked up from her ledger, her round face brightening. Miss Marple, come to escape the gloom, have you? It's been nothing but talk of poor Reverend Hargreaves since Sunday. She gestured to a stool by the counter, where a kettle was already steaming. Tea, thank you, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple said, settling herself with her knitting bag. I find a bit of conversation does wonders for clarity. The village must be full of thoughts about the Reverend's death. Mrs. Bantry nodded, pouring tea with practiced ease. Oh, it's all anyone can talk about. Poison in the communion wine, shocking, isn't it? Some say it's a madman, but I say it's someone close. You don't poison a man like that without knowing his ways. Her eyes gleamed with the relish of a born storyteller. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of mild interest. Indeed, people notice things, don't they? Small details, perhaps, about who was where on Sunday morning. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, there's plenty of talk. Old Mr. Giles, the farmer, was in yesterday. Said he saw young Eliza Gray near the churchyard before the service, looking all furtive. Not picking flowers, he said. She was by the vestry window, peering in. Thought it odd, but then, she's a queer girl, always keeping to herself. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Eliza is a sensitive soul, she said. Grief can make one act strangely. Did Mr. Giles see anyone else? Not that he mentioned, Mrs. Bantry said, stirring sugar into her tea. But Miss Pratt, the postmistress, had a tale. She says Mr. Pike's been getting letters from London, regular as clockwork. And he's always off there. Too says it's church business. But he comes back with suits finer than a vicar's stipend could buy. Makes you wonder where the money comes from. She raised an eyebrow, inviting speculation. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. A deacon's duties don't usually require such frequent travel. Did Miss Pratt say anything about the letters? Only that they're from some firm in London solicitors, she thinks. She's got an eye for postmarks, that one. Oh, and Mrs. Carter, who cleans for the vicarage, said she saw Mrs. Hargreaves burning papers in the garden a few days before the Reverend died. Letters, maybe, or bills. Looked guilty about it, Mrs. Carter said. Mrs. Bantry leaned back, satisfied with her contribution. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her gentle smile. How observant people are. And Mr. Blackwood, any talk about the sexton? Mrs. Bantry shrugged. Not much. He's a door sort, keeps to himself. But young Tommy, the baker's boy, says he saw Blackwood in the churchyard late Saturday, hammering at something near the vestry. Roof slates, likely, but Tommy thought. He looked angry, not like his usual self. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the gossip like a prospector panning for gold. Eliza, by the vestry window, Pike's London letters, Clara's burned papers. Blackwood's late-night task each was a fragment, not yet a picture, but telling nonetheless. The village sees more than it knows, she said softly, and sometimes it knows more than it says. Mrs. Bantry chuckled. You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Mind you, there's talk about Clara, too. Before she married the Reverend, she was sweet on a solicitor in town, Mr. Wentworth, who moved to London last year. Nothing came of it, but folk don't forget. Some say she wasn't happy, always wanting more than a vicar's life. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts racing. The solicitor's letters in the vicarage study, the London postmark, Clara's ink-stained sleeve, could they connect to this old romance? And Pike's trips, his costly handkerchief did, they point to a life beyond his means, funded by church funds. Eliza's fear and Blackwood's silence added their own hues to the tapestry. But the pattern was still incomplete. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and stepped back into the lane, the sun now high and warm. The village gossip, like her knitting, was a tangle of threads, but each held a clue. She would need to confirm Mr. Giles' sighting of Eliza, probe Pike's London connections, and learn more about Clara's burned papers. Blackwood's late-night task might be innocent, but his anger, if true, was worth noting. As she walked toward her cottage, Miss Marple's mind wove the fragments together, her needles clicking in her bag, as if in agreement. The truth was there, hidden in the village's chatter, waiting for her to stitch it into place. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The vicarage parlor, with its faded curtains and worn furniture, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Jane Marple arranged the gathering. The fire and the grate cast flickering shadows on the walls, lending an air of quiet drama to the scene. It was early evening in St. Mary Mead, the village hushed under a sky heavy with stars. and Miss Marple had requested the presence of Clara Hargreaves, Timothy Blackwood, Lawrence Pike, and Eliza Gray. Constable Reed stood by the door, his notebook at the ready, his young face taut with anticipation. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair with her knitting in her lap, exuded a calm authority, her pale blue eyes sharp beneath their gentle facade. The suspects entered one by one, each betraying their unease in subtle ways. Clara, her auburn hair pinned tightly, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting to the others as she took a seat. Blackwood, his weathered hands clasped tightly, stood near the fireplace, his expression one of stoic reserve. Pike, impeccable in his tailored suit, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his fingers adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. Eliza, pale and trembling, perched on the edge of a sofa, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft click of Miss Marple's needles. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, but carrying a weight that stilled the room. "The death of Reverend Hargreaves has cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead, and it is our duty to bring light to it. I have been looking into the matter, and certain facts have come to my attention. I thought it best to share them with you, too. See if we might find the truth together." Clara's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. Pike's smile tightened, while Blackwood's jaw clenched, and Eliza seemed to shrink further into herself. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and produced the vestry ledger, its faded green cover a stark contrast to the polished table. "This ledger," she said, "records the church's donations, but some entries are irregular. Large sums, listed as anonymous, appear and then vanish, marked as vague expenses. Yet the Reverend's private ledger, found in his study, shows no such transactions. Someone has been altering the books." A murmur rippled through the room. Clara's hand tightened on her handkerchief. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, Pike's smile faltered, and Eliza gasped softly. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. "The poison cyanide, as Dr. Haydock confirmed, was in the communion wine, placed there by someone who knew the Reverend would drink first. The vial I found in the vestry suggests a deliberate act, requiring access and opportunity. Each of you was near the vestry that morning, or the evening before." Pike leaned forward, his voice smooth but edged. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting we're all guilty? I was in the choir loft during the service, as I told you. I had no reason to harm the Reverend." Miss Marple's eyes met his, serene but unyielding. "Indeed, Mr. Pike. But you were seen in the vestry Saturday evening by Mr. Blackwood, and again Sunday morning by others. Your frequent trips to London, and those fine suits, suggest a lifestyle beyond a deacon's means. The ledgers forged, entries written, in a hand not unlike your own point to a motive. Money, perhaps, taken from the church to fund your ambitions." Pike's face flushed, his hand twitching toward his cufflinks. "That's absurd. I managed the accounts, yes, but I never touched the wine. And my trips to London are for church business. Ask anyone." His voice rose, but Miss Marple's calm gaze held him fast. She turned to Clara. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you've been distressed about the study desk, and that ink stain on your sleeve suggests you've been writing. Were you aware of the ledger's discrepancies? Or perhaps you burned papers to protect someone or yourself?" Clara's eyes widened, her handkerchief crumpling in her fist. "I burned old bills, nothing more. Clement never told me about the accounts. I loved him." Her voice broke, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked to Pike, a fleeting glance of fear or complicity. "To Blackwood," Miss Marple said. "You, Mr. Blackwood, have served the church faithfully. Yet you were in the churchyard late Saturday, seen by a boy, and your loyalty might hide a deeper grievance. Did the Reverend's suspicions about the accounts threaten you?" Blackwood's face darkened, his hands clenching. I'd never harm him. He was a good man, better than most. I saw Pike in the vestry, but I didn't touch the wine. My work's honest. His voice was gruff, but Miss Marple caught a tremor of sincerity. Finally, she turned to Eliza, whose face was ashen. My dear, you heard the Reverend argue with Mr. Pike about money, and you saw a shadow by the vestry window. Your fear has kept you silent, but silence can protect the wrong person. Was it Mr. Pike you saw, or someone else? Eliza's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. I don't know. It was just a shadow. I was afraid to look closer. She glanced at Pike, then away. Her hands trembling, Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a steady counterpoint to the tension. The truth is close, she said. The ledger points to theft, and the poison to a need to silence suspicion. Mr. Pike, your presence in the vestry, your London connection cyanide, is not easily come by, but a man with your resources might find a way. A chemist, perhaps, from your trips. Pike stood, his composure cracking. This is outrageous. You've no proof, just village gossip and a few scribbles in a book. I demand. His voice cut off as Reed stepped forward. His hand raised. Marple's voice remained calm. Proof will come, Mr. Pike. The vial is being tested, and witnesses saw you near the vestry. The Reverend's trust was betrayed, and the truth will not stay hidden. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. If anyone knows more, now is the time to speak. The room was silent. The fires crackled the only sound. Pike's face was pale, his hands clenched, while Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. Blackwood's jaw set, and Eliza's breath came in shallow gasps. Miss Marple knew the confrontation had stirred the waters, and the truth, like sediment, would soon rise to the surface. Chapter 12. The Deacon's Downfall. The vicarage parlor, steeped in the soft glow of lamplight, seemed to tighten around its occupants, as Miss Jane Marple's gentle voice cut through the silence left by her confrontation. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting faint shadows that danced across the faces of Clara Hargreaves, Timothy Blackwood, Lawrence Pike, and Eliza Gray. Constable Reed stood by the door, his notebook clutched tightly, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple as she resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome, marking the rhythm of truth. Murder, Miss Marple said softly, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the weather, is a desperate act, born of fear or greed. Reverend Hargreaves was a man of trust, but trust betrayed can lead to dangerous ends. The ledger from the vestry, with its forged entries, tells us someone was stealing from the church. The poison in the communion wine tells us they would kill to keep their secret. Her eyes, pale and piercing, swept the room, lingering on each face. Pike's composure, already frayed, began to unravel. He stood abruptly, his polished facade cracking like thin ice. This is preposterous, he snapped, his voice sharp with indignation. You weave a tale from gossip and a few numbers in a book, but you've no evidence. I was in the choir loft, as I said. I had no cause to harm the Reverend. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he adjusted his cufflinks, and Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat on his brow. She tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise. No, Mr. Pike. Yet the ledger shows sums vanishing under your watch, sums that match your frequent trips to London, your fine suits, your monogrammed handkerchiefs. The Reverend, I believe, began to suspect. Eliza overheard your argument. With him, did she not? About money, and trust betrayed. Eliza, huddled on the sofa, flinched at her name, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't mean to listen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was weeks ago, in the study. The Reverend said the accounts were wrong, that he'd trusted you. You sounded angry, said it was a mistake, that he'd ruin everything. Her words spilled out, and she covered her mouth, as if shocked by her own confession. Pike's face paled, his smile gone. "The girl's mistaken," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I argued with him, yes, about modernizing the services, not money." She misheard. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. Did she? And what of the shadow by the vestry window, seen by Eliza on Sunday morning? "You were there, Mr. Pike, as Mr. Blackwood confirmed for Saturday evening. The vial I found, now with Dr. Haydock, held cyanide, procured perhaps from a chemist you visited in London. Your trips were not all for church business, were they?" Clara gasped, her handkerchief falling to her lap. "Cyanide," she whispered. "But how could anyone?" Her eyes darted to Pike, then away, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of doubt in her expression. Blackwood, silent until now, stepped forward, his weathered face set in a scowl. "I told you I saw him in the vestry Saturday night," he said gruffly. "Looked guilty when I walked in, like he'd been caught at something. I didn't think it was this, but I knew he was up to no good." Pike's eyes flashed with desperation. "Lies, all of it. Blackwood's just protecting himself. He's in the vestry as much as I am. And Clara, she burned papers, didn't she? Why not look at her?" His voice rose, accusing, but Miss Marple's calm remained unshaken. She turned to Clara, her tone gentle. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you did burn papers, as the village cleaners noticed, and the ink on your sleeve suggests you've been writing, perhaps letters to a solicitor in London. Were you planning to leave the Reverend, my dear? Or was it something else?" Clara's face crumpled, tears spilling over. "I wasn't leaving him," she said, her voice breaking. "The letters were to Mr. Wentworth, yes, about an inheritance I never told Clement about. I was ashamed. He'd have wanted it for the church, but I wanted something for myself. The ink was from writing to him, that's all. I swear I didn't touch the wine." Her sobs filled the room, and Miss Marple nodded. Her suspicions about Clara's secret clarified. She turned back to Pike, whose bravado was fading. "The truth, Mr. Pike, is like a dropped stitch. It unravels if you pull at it. The Reverend suspected your theft, didn't he? You siphoned funds, forging entries to cover your tracks, but he noticed. That argument Eliza overheard was his warning to you, and when he grew too close, you used cyanide, knowing his habit of drinking first at communion. The vial was your mistake, left in haste." Pike's shoulders slumped, his hands falling to his sides. "You can't prove it," he said, but his voice was hollow, the fight draining from him. "You've nothing but guesses." Miss Marple's smile was serene but relentless. "Dr. Haydock will confirm the vial's contents, and the police will trace your London contacts. A chemist, I suspect, will remember a man like you, and the ledger's handwriting careful, but not the Reverend's will match yours, I'm sure." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Pike's face contorted, and he sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. "It was a mistake," he whispered. "I took a little to start a new life. He found out, said he'd expose me. I couldn't let him ruin everything. The cyanide, it was quick. No one else was meant to suffer." His voice broke, and Constable Reed stepped forward, his expression grim. "You'll come with me, Mr. Pike," Reed said, his voice steady now. "We'll sort this out at the station." As Pike was led away, Clara sobbed quietly. Blackwood's face softened with relief, and Eliza's trembling eased, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with gratitude. The parlor seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating like mist. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her work here done. "The truth," she said softly, "is a heavy thing, but it sets things right." She rose, her shawl draped neatly, and stepped into the night, the stars above St. Mary Mead, bright and untroubled once more.